there is no government in the world that could do things to invite sanctions to itself. I think the truth of the matter is that as Zimbabweans, we have got a trust deficit between our people and government. I think we need to trust each other, to be patriotic, and nobody really, there's nobody who doesn't know how the sanctions came, and that it is usually some of us, not necessarily government, who go out there and talk ill of their own nation. I think it is incumbent upon all of us as citizens of Zimbabwe to defend our own nation.
So for more on this, U.S. correspondent Sherwin Bryce-Pease joins us now live. Sherwin, a very good evening to you. Thanks indeed for your time. So share with us more details of what exactly the statement from Mike Pompeo says.
Yeah, very hard-hitting statement from the United States Secretary of State, Griselda Lewis. He talks about 2 years ago, Zimbabwean authorities launched what he refers to as a violent crackdown against citizens who were protesting flawed elections, of course, referring to those July 30th, 2018 elections. The same government has yet to hold anyone accountable for the 6 protesters who were killed that day. To mark the anniversary of their deaths, today the United States is taking action to fight corruption in Zimbabwe. And of course, as you correctly point out, adding businessman and advisor to the president, Kudakwashe Tagwirei, what they describe, or whom they describe as a notoriously corrupt Zimbabwean businessman, to that list of individuals who have been sanctioned by the U.S. government since 2003. Tagwirei, of course, joining the likes of Emerson Mnangagwa, various officials in the senior hierarchies of the Zimbabwean government and ZANU-PF, and including the clip you just played there. If I correctly saw that on the screen, Griselda, it was Setembiso Nyoni, the acting information minister, who also happens to be on the sanctions list. So certainly joining an illustrious group of Zimbabweans, if you will, being sanctioned by the U.S. government today.
Let's talk about that. Zimbabwe has been under the U.S. microscope in terms of economic sanctions since 2001. So remind us what both Congress and the White House have imposed on Zimbabwe since.
Yeah, so there are 2 tranches of punitive measures, if you will, for use of a better description. First, you have legislative action by the United States Congress, known as the Zimbabwe Democracy and Economic Recovery Act, which was passed in a bipartisan fashion by both chambers of the U.S. Congress and signed into law by former President George W. Bush in 2001. And what that does is it essentially restricts Zimbabwe's credit lines to multilateral financial institutions like the International Monetary Fund or the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, which is essentially the lending arm of the World Bank. And in terms of that legislation, Griselda, it talks about lifting these restrictions on Zimbabwe when the United States is satisfied with the restoration of the rule of law in Zimbabwe, including aspects like freedom of speech and association, which is a big conversation point in Zimbabwe right now, given the incarceration of journalists, people that are in hiding, but whether from the Fourth Estate fraternity or the opposition in Zimbabwe. And it calls for an end to lawlessness and violence and intimidation. So ZEDERA is an act that remains on the books because they do not feel Zimbabwe has met the criteria for lifting those restrictions. Then you have an executive action, which was first signed into law through executive order by George Bush in 2003, and it literally produces a list, Griselda, a list of various, about 80 Zimbabwean individuals, about 3 pages long, including the former President Mugabe, Grace Mugabe, Joyce Mujuru, people who served in the prior administration, Emerson Mnangagwa, Constantine Chiwenga, the second Vice President, Kembo Mohadi, and the list goes on. Yeah. And so the businessman that has been sanctioned today, in terms of the executive order that started in 2003 and has since been renewed by the Obama administration and then subsequently the Trump administration. That is the list to which this businessman has now been added.
And of course, Sherwin, that long list, targeted sanctions, which is imposed through executive order, as you said, comes up for renewal once a year. And President Trump continuing as his predecessors have done by extending them again in March of this year.
Absolutely right, and has done so in March since taking office in 2017. And this was also done by President Obama and President the presidents that have come before him. And I'll just read you a bit of what the note that the White House sent to Congress in terms of the renewal of these targeted sanctions in the wake of the resignation of former President Robert Mugabe in November 2017, Zimbabwe's national elections in July 2018, and President Mugabe's subsequent death in 2019, Zimbabwe has had ample opportunity to implement reforms that could set the country on a constructive path, stabilize the Southern African region, and open the door to greater cooperation with the United States. Unfortunately, President Emmerson Mnangagwa's administration has yet to signal a credible political will to implement such reforms. Indeed, the Zimbabwean government has arguably accelerated its persecution of critics and economic mismanagement in the past year, during which security forces have conducted extrajudicial killings, rapes, and alleged abductions of numerous dissidents. So the broad view, certainly from this administration and those that have come before it, is that the reforms that were so promised by the new administration under Zimbabwe's President Emmerson Mnangagwa have not come to fruition, and so those U.S. sanctions for the time being will remain in place.
Sherwin, thanks indeed for your time. SABC news correspondent in the United States, Sherwin Bryce-Pease, joining us there. Thanks indeed for joining us here on the program.